It's so nice to see all of you and to have these lovely friends on this stage today talking about the Whitney women and the museum that they made. I'd like to start by introducing them with remarks by Thelma Golden, the executive director of the Studio Museum, who at one time was a curator at the Whitney. To quote, "One of the great pleasures and privileges of my time at the Whitney was getting to know Flora Biddle and Fiona Donovan. Flora and Fiona, amazing and remarkable women in their own right, offered me a direct link to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was a source of endless inspiration as I charted my curatorial path. I was deeply inspired by her interest, motivations, and accomplishments. Understanding and owning Gertrude's prescient commitment to American artists, which stemmed from her profound engagement with the visionaries of her time, provided an exemplar for me when I became the director of the Studio Museum. I remain inspired by her as the Whitney continues to have a profound influence on the trajectory of American art." Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Donna. It's a great privilege to be here speaking to this distinguished audience and to you and Ben. Since I can remember, art was magic. That has never changed. And the museum, the Whitney Museum for me, was the force that could bring about wonder, understanding, and happiness, not only to me, but to everyone who came. I've been doubly blessed by working closely with my wonderful mother, Flora Whitney Miller, and with my beloved daughter, Fiona Donovan, a brilliant writer, art historian, and teacher.
Thank you.
The Whitney Museum of American Art was founded by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, my grandmother, Fiona's great-grandmother. I want to tell you a little bit about my amazing grandmother. In the middle of the 17th century, Gertrude's ancestors immigrated to New Amsterdam. By the early 1800s, they were farmers on Staten Island. One enterprising 16-year-old, Cornelius Vanderbilt, bought a small boat for $100 borrowed from his parents and began ferrying passengers and freight to Manhattan. From that start, through ambition, intelligence, hard work, and energy, he became tremendously successful. And here's the Commodore, so called because of the large shipping interests which he created and through which he prospered. In 1875, his great-granddaughter, Gertrude, was born into one of the richest families in our country. Here's the Vanderbilt's house on Fifth Avenue.
There you go.
Oops, sorry. And here's their summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. The house in New York is where Bergdorf Goodman's is now, on Fifth Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets. As a child, Gertrude's strong personality was already evident.
You want me to do
What am
this
I
part?
doing wrong?
Nothing.
Sorry,
Nothing.
everyone.
Nothing.
As she later wrote, one of the first things I remember was how I longed to be a boy. I was 4 years old when, unable to resist the temptation longer, I secreted myself in my mother's room and proceeded to cut off all my curls. This, it seemed to me, was what distinguished me most from my brothers. They said only girls had curls, so mine were sacrificed, and all I gained was a severe punishment. Gertrude grew up in a world of privilege and rules. She had a loving family, but her life was constrained by the endless societal boundaries of the time. Reading Edith Wharton or Henry James can give you the flavor of such an upbringing. It was hard for her to believe that a beau loved her for herself. Surely he cared only for her fortune. When she fell in love with Harry Whitney, however, she knew that wouldn't be an issue. His fortune, while not as great as hers, was older. His family much more accepted. And this is Harry Whitney at polo game. He was really a hero. He was a star at polo at a time when polo games were on the front pages of all the newspapers all the time. He went abroad as well as across our country playing and as the captain of that amazing team of 4 people. So Gertrude and Harry fell madly in love and married and went on their honeymoon in Japan. Here they are. And here she is in a portrait by her friend, the artist Howard Cushing, looking, doesn't work very well.
There we go.
There, looking kind of young and soft and vulnerable, which was one persona of hers. There were others. And here she is. Here she is. Here are 3 generations of her family. Her mother, Alice, herself, and her first baby, my mother, Flora. Although she enjoyed dressing up for costume balls and was often photographed in portraits by Baron de Meyer, Gertrude felt trapped in a cycle. Here she is dancing with a parrot at a war relief for World War II ball. And the portrait is by the photographer, de Meyer. Gertrude felt trapped in a cycle of social and family duties. She wrote later, quote, "I couldn't free myself of certain feelings. I wanted to work. I was not very happy or satisfied in my life. The more I tried to forget myself in my life, the less I succeeded in doing so. I had always drawn and painted a little. Now I wanted to try modeling." And in the early years of the new 20th century, Gertrude became a serious artist, a sculptor. Here she is in her sculpting clothes, and here she is making a figure for a fountain for the Hotel Arlington.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. While we admire this slide, our sound technician is going to adjust the microphone slightly so we get rid of that.
Is there a better place for me to point this? Straight back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. She wrote about becoming an artist. "I used to be very scared of my emotions. I used to hide behind a curtain and preserve a discreet silence. By force of expressing myself in my work, my shyness has become much less. I came to be happy in meeting people with big personalities, especially artists. When I first started the sculpture work, my friends took the attitude of watching one of their number performing a difficult parlor trick. They neither could nor would understand why anybody who didn't have to work, who didn't have to spend hours over a mess of clay, should do so of her own volition. But she loved what she was doing, and it transformed her into a very strong, ambitious woman. She competed hard for the commissions that she sought, and later described some issues that many women still face today. "Time and time again, I discovered that where a group of laymen had to decide between 2 people a question of assigning a commission to an artist, the woman of wealth lost out, and for no other reason than because she was a woman of wealth." And here is one of her first, here is her very first big commission, a figure for the Titanic Memorial. to honor those who were lost when the Titanic sank. And she felt strongly that as soon as that monument was placed in a park in Washington, where you can still see it today, and after it went up and it was noticed by people who stood high in the opinions of other people, there came a definite change. It is the type of change that always follows public recognition. Those who had been inclined to discount the work I was doing were now ready to assure me that they had always been convinced of my ability. That, by the way, was more than I had always been convinced of. It was the kindness of artists that helped me through the dark ages. Despite her difficulties, she deeply believed that artists have the sublime joy of giving themselves to the world. It is in the expressing that the real joy exists. In 1907, she wrote about her new studio in Greenwich Village. Today, I moved into the new studio, which abounds in suggestion and inspiration. The ceiling is high, and one's ideas soar upward. I felt at once that I must do something large in it. Life is lived in such a place, and eras in one's existence marked. In 2 large galleries on the ground floor, Gertrude began exhibiting works by the American artists she realized had no place to show in a New York obsessed with European art and culture. There was really nowhere that American artists could show in those days. She was the only one who did it. Her studio eventually grew into the Whitney Museum of American Art. Over the years, she added more buildings for galleries, for spaces for artists on the staff to live, because all members of the small staff were artists, and unusual extras, such as a squash court, a library, and beautiful furnishings, even a Ouija board. At the same time as this was going on, Robert Henry painted this portrait of her. She couldn't hang it in her uptown house because she was wearing pants. But it's a beautiful painting. Here are some of her sculptures and some of the commissions she worked so very hard to win. Here she is working on a World War I model for a monument. And here's a large monument that still exists on the coast of France in Saint-Nazaire that was dedicated to those who had been killed during World War I. And here she is with a very large sculpture of Buffalo Bill, which you can see how large because she's standing right there next to it. And here is the dedication. It's right in the middle of Cody, Wyoming. In case any of you have been there, you've probably seen it. And this is one of her very last major monuments. It was to Columbus, the Columbus Memorial of 1929. And she was very, very happy with this piece. It's huge. I have been there, and it's on the edge of the town that Columbus left from to come and discover this continent. She went to the opening, and then a few days later she wrote, "I was so tired the first days, and I did not know why. Now I do. It is only now that I realize I was living in emotions. To see suddenly before you the real dream in great blocks of stone is overpowering. The cloud shapes one visualized come down to earth. God, the fascination of building, of creation. And always back of it, the dream come true, the vision materialized. And now, a week later, the tiredness is gone. Why worry that old age has come, if it has not come with atrophied mind and energy? The face may fall, but the spirit may rise. Tomorrow I will feel that nothing recompenses for youth, but tonight nothing recompenses for expression." Meantime, she was always working on the Whitney Studio Club, as she named her exhibition space on 8th Street. And here is a picture of it with one of the first sculpture annuals, because in those days there was sculpture annual one year and painting annual the following year. And this is the office sitting room of the Whitney Studio Club. You can see how cozy and welcoming it is. People really loved to go there. It had beautiful fabrics on the walls, and artists were always welcome. This was always a museum that was made for artists to come. She had wonderful parties for the openings of exhibitions with big sandwiches and plenty of drinks, all of which the artists really needed and wanted. And at the same time, she was helping artists with all kinds of things, like perhaps a rent payment or a hospital stay or a trip to France to study. And here is one artist, John Sloan, who wrote saying, "Help, help!" and I'm sure they did. Here is her first director, Juliana Force, and Gertrude at the opening of the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1931. So it opened as a museum then. And Gertrude spoke. She said, "I have collected during these years the work of American artists because I believe them worthwhile and because I have believed in our national creative talent. Now I am making this collection the nucleus of a museum devoted exclusively to American art, a museum which will grow and increase in importance as we ourselves grow. In making this gift to you, the American public, my chief desire is that you should share with me the joy which I have received from these works of art. It is especially in times like these that we need to look to the spiritual. In art, we find it. It takes us into a world of beauty not too far removed from any of us. Man cannot live by bread alone." And here is the facade as it was then, and looks very much the same today, as it's an art school now. Here's the door of the Whitney, and my grandmother sitting in the midst of many of her sculptures. She was getting ready to have an exhibition. And she died in 1942, leaving the museum to my mother, her daughter, Flora Miller. And now Fiona will continue the story.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Do you want me to click? Do you want me to click for you?
I just want to take a moment's station break for a little plug. Not that I'm biased, but this is a book that my mother wrote after she served as president at the museum for many, many years. It is full of incredible anecdotes that would interest anyone who has any interest in boards of any kind. And I strongly urge you all to read it. It's for sale downstairs.
And Fiona wrote a wonderful introduction to it.
There she goes. Didn't I tell you this morning?
Thank you, Fee.
So I'm going to continue to tell you a little bit about this story of 5 generations of women fortunate enough to share common interests and blessed with the love, camaraderie, and joy that absorption brings. Here's a fun picture showing the span of this legacy. I snapped in a wonderful show of portraits from the Whitney's permanent collection, from Gertrude to my niece and daughter, 2 Floras who are both involved with the Whitney now, along with a host of other 5th-generation cousins, including my nephew Michael, who's at the back of the room. When Donna kindly asked my mom and me if we would speak about the Whitney and Gertrude's legacy today, I decided it might be appropriate to complement her more historical and anecdotal talk with some observations about why she and I, and now this fifth generation, continue to be involved with the life of the museum 90 years after its founding. It's really quite incredible to have this legacy. I guess the real issue is why, now that the museum has existed as a public institution for over half a century, since the first non-family trustees were appointed in the 1960s, and is clearly thriving in its new building, that it remains important to carry on this legacy that Gertrude left. But first, a little more history. As my mother described, the Whitney Museum was not only started by Gertrude, but totally supported by her for the 11 years from 1931 to 1942. In 1936, my grandmother, Flora Miller, became a trustee and served as president from the year Gertrude died in 1942 until she became chair in 1967. By the late 1940s, the museum had outgrown its 8th Street building. With many commercial galleries moving to 57th Street, that seemed the place to be. In a somewhat felicitous act of generosity, my grandmother's cousin and close friend, Jock Whitney, who was then MoMA's chair, offered the Whitney land adjoining MoMA on 54th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. Auguste Noel of the architectural firm Noel and Miller, which he and my grandfather had started, designed the interiors and facade of this building, while Philip Johnson designed the exterior of the garden side. And it was sort of fantastic because you actually, I think you walked through MoMA to get to the Whitney. So it was this nice joining of forces at this particular moment. And Carter Foster, who I'll be speaking with later, just showed me all these amazing installation shots of exhibitions at this museum. Here's my grandmother in 1966, second from left, at the first meeting of the Whitney's National Committee, a key group that continues to draw interest and support for the Whitney today from collectors around the United States and beyond. My grandmother worked closely with 4 of the Whitney's directors, including Tom Armstrong, who honored her in creating a book about her life published after she died in 1986, and you see it at the top there. That's the cover of the book, the title etched in my grandmother's signature, and the edge decorated with fabric from a chair in her New York apartment. You also see her at lower left doing one of her beloved acrostics in her garden in Paris, where Gertrude had a studio. And Tom Armstrong with artist Jasper Johns in front of his painting, 3 Flags, which the Whitney purchased in 1980 for $1 million. At that time, the highest price for a work by a living artist. Given her self-effacing nature, my grandmother was quite an unorthodox leader. In the Flora book, however, Tom related how, in my sense of the history of the museum, she will always be the most vital and essential part. It was Flora, more than any other person, who was determined that the Whitney Museum should survive and surpass even the aspirations her mother had had for it. He continued, "As I sat with her in her Long Island home, next to her sun porch filled with sculpture from her mother's era, it was impossible not to recognize, even though Gertrude will always be revered as the founder of the Whitney Museum, it was Flora who accomplished a more difficult task, to bring it from the domain of private wealth and personal concern for artists into the ranks of major public institutions enjoyed and acclaimed by international audiences. Sort of an interesting idea today when privately owned museums seem to be on the rise. And here is my grandmother, Flora, with the first group of non-family trustees in 1961. As the child of two of the most affluent and influential families in the United States, my grandmother, Flora, grew up in an environment of immense wealth and power, led by men who to a great extent shaped American industry and transportation. She embraced the challenge of her legacy with grace and seeming ease in a world somewhat removed from that of her carefree youth, a post-war era in which the power and fortunes of families such as hers were diminished by the loss of accumulated wealth. To me, this image of my grandmother surrounded by men is sort of strange, but I suppose it speaks to the era. Today, the Whitney has about 50 trustees, nearly half of them women. And here's the Breuer Building on the left, and my grandmother at the 1966 opening. Undoubtedly, it was not easy for this private woman, who it seemed to me preferred being with her family and hearing tales of her grandchildren's dalliances, to having a public role at the museum. But she adored her mother and deeply believed in her commitment to supporting living artists, and she carried on what her mother had started with grace and wisdom. Her success in this seemed to me guided by the belief that she shared with her mother that art and artists enlighten and add immeasurably to our lives. She had an incredible elegance in her colorful pantsuits, lacquered red nails, often cradling a chic cigarette holder, and an incredibly suggestive voice. And her warmth drew people to her, always making them feel at home. Like her mother, she continued to foster the museum's relationships with artists. This set the Whitney apart from peer institutions and continues to guide its mission today. Until the late 40s, all the Whitney staff were in fact artists. As it developed, the museum became sort of like an extended family. And here is my grandmother toasting Cylone Brown, one of the museum's longtime guards. He was the head guards since the museum's earliest days, and you see them at his retirement party. And also with the artist Edward Hopper. Hopper's wife, Josephine, left the entire Hopper estate to the Whitney, recognizing that, as Hopper himself wrote to my grandmother, quote, "You no doubt know that the Whitney gave me my first exhibition, and the museum has shown my canvases and watercolors every year since then. I owe much to the Whitney Museum for the recognition that has come to me." By 1970, my grandmother's deep involvement with the museum receded. By then, however, my mother had assumed a larger role. My mom began as a volunteer in the mid-1950s at the Whitney on 54th Street, welcoming visitors and answering questions at the front desk of the museum. Then, in 1958, she became a trustee and has since served as president, chairman, and now honorary chair. She has been on the board for 60 years.
Oh, goodness. Yikes.
Her commitment and openness to the new, and particularly her engaging way with people, I know I don't need to tell all of you this, have had a tremendous impact on the museum's character. My siblings and I joke that we can't go anywhere with her, be it a Midwestern city, a village in India, or a hill town in Italy, without running into someone in the art world she knows from her involvement with the museum. In 1977, my mother became president of the museum. She moved to New York after she and my father separated, and she immersed herself in her new life. My siblings and I were then in college or beyond, but we had grown up in suburban Connecticut with a free-spirited mother who spent years driving a station wagon, ferrying my siblings and me and all of our friends around to the skating rink, lacrosse games, and music lessons. So her move was a big change. While we were growing up, it was only at the dinner table that I gathered there was an exotic life beyond the suburbs, a life of art and artists, a spirited community on 75th Street and Madison Avenue. What I remember just as well about those conversations, though, was my parents' talk about balancing budgets and fundraising, those prickly details that consume active trustees. So my mother allowed these details to become her challenge and soon became a key ally to then director Tom Armstrong. At dinners at our house on 66th Street, in what had once been my great-grandmother's carriage house, she gathered lively parties of artists, patrons, and museum staff. She proved to be a tireless and effective fundraiser. She and Tom worked as a team to encourage collectors to donate their masterworks to the Whitney. And here you see a group of works that entered the collection in the 1980s. In this way, the permanent collection developed significantly in quality. At the same time, the museum began acquiring works by certain key artists in depth, including Calder, Nodelman, O'Keeffe, and Johns, and many more. Meanwhile, those moments at supper with my parents musing on the museum's finances became so ingrained in my mind that when it came time for me to go to college and after that to graduate school, I decided to focus instead on art and artists, and I became an art historian. And I've also now served on the Whitney board for several years. And so, guided by my parents' multifaceted model and my own education, I came to agree with my mother and my grandmother before her that the Whitney is vitally important and our responsibility to care for. It has provided a link for all of us, a significant interest that we share and pass along, and that each one of us has conspired about with the one who came before. In this way, it has brought a succession of mothers and daughters a certain degree of intimacy, as happens when families are caring for what they cherish. I should add that we have always had a great deal of fun there as well. The Whitney's current director, Adam Weinberg, is smart and strategic, has an incredible way with all people, and a deep appreciation of the Whitney's mission. From the time he became director in 2004, he and the board focused on building expansion, though it would take nearly 10 years before the new building was realized. Given today's tremendous audience for contemporary art, the Breuer building had simply run out of space. After considering options, the best one seemed to be a move downtown to the southern tip of the High Line. Working with extremely supportive New York City officials, the site was secured and Renzo Piano named as architect. Adam's incredible staff worked closely with Piano's office on every detail, from ceiling to baseboard height and many aspects in between. And I really believe that that's one of the reasons that the Whitney building is the amazing building that it is. From that collaboration between the staff. And I have to give Scott Rothkopf, who's here, the museum's chief curator, a lot of credit for that. Piano's striking building responds to the seafaring history of the Hudson River and its large ships, as well as to the industrial character of the neighboring loft buildings and elevated railway of the High Line Park, while asserting a contemporary sculptural presence. In this way, it unites past and present and links the museum to its own history on nearby 8th Street. Just wanted to show a few more exterior views. I assume you've all been there, but in case you haven't. The building is double the size of Breuer. It has a transparency and openness that couldn't be more different than Breuer's fortress-like granite structure. The new Whitney has welcomed more than triple the number of visitors at Breuer, about 1 million annually. From inside the building, visitors look at the art, but also out to the city and across the Hudson to the country beyond, creating this openness that reflects on the Whitney's history and seems to link, whether metaphorically or not, city and nation and its people to the art on view. The first show in the new museum, called America is Hard to See, filled its galleries with over 600 works from the Whitney's collection in thoughtful groupings that suggested sensibilities and themes rather than rigid categories. The organization allowed the works to speak to each other and tell new stories, giving visitors a chance to see familiar objects in a new way and to discover works rarely seen before. The survey became a guidepost for the many stories still to tell in ongoing exhibitions and acquisitions. I wanted to end with this sort of amusing image that was an ad for the new museum. It's my great-grandmother in the Boom Boom room at the top of the Standard Hotel. The Whitney really still lives by the goals that my great-grandmother defined: to support American artists in an inclusive manner, adhering to a tradition of openness to many art forms, and the acceptance of a multiplicity of styles. This couldn't be done without the incredible board of trustees that has developed through the years since the first non-family members became trustees in the early 60s. So it really has grown from this private, small institution to the major institution it is today. And I have to thank all the members of the board and all the public who has supported the museum for turning it into this glorious place that it is today. As my great-grandmother explained in 1931, when the museum opened, would that we practical Americans, with our love of money, our unbounded belief in ourselves, could cultivate an eye for the artistic in all phases of our too full and hurried lives. If we could but rise in the morning artistically, to work or play artistically, to eat, sleep, and love artistically. Gertrude's ideas about the role of art in our lives are as fresh and vital today as they were when she founded the museum. And even though the extent of my involvement doesn't compare with that of my forebears, the Whitney will always be a significant part of my life. Even as the museum has experienced tremendous growth, both my mother and I continue to remain close to the staff and expanded Whitney community. The museum has always been about relationships between people, and even as it grows, it continues to have many of the endearing characteristics of a wonderful family. So we hope that you will all come visit. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yay, Fee.
We do have time for some questions, but before we do that, can I just go back to...
It's
Oops.
the one on the left.
Oop. I just want to ask you a quick question, if you would be willing to answer it, about one of the Whitney's purchases, which was the Calder Circus. If you could just take a minute or two to describe
Who,
that.
me?
Yes, you. I think you're uniquely qualified.
Oh dear, it's such a long story. I don't know if there's
Just-
time. When Calder died, he was a dual citizen of France and the United States, and we were in the middle of an exhibition of his work, and the French wished to take they didn't have enough money to pay the taxes, in other words, and the Whitney. He had installed the circus in the lobby of the Breuer building, where maybe some of you saw it or have seen it since then. And the circus was one of his signature, iconic works, a wonderful, wonderful piece. And France was wanting to take it in lieu of the taxes because it was valuable. And in fact, they wanted, as I remember, $1.25 million for it. So if we could raise the $1.25 million, we could keep it. And he had installed it himself. He had placed all the figures in it. Everyone loved this piece, and we couldn't bear the idea that it was going to France. So Tom and I and a few other people decided that we were going to try. Tom Armstrong, who was the director, decided that we were going to try and raise the money, even though it seemed hopeless, because in those days we just weren't raising that kind of money at all. So we collected all the people who owned the Barnum and Bailey Circus said they would help us. And they sent the kids and themselves and the clowns all over the parks in the city with little tin cans saying, "Save the Calder Circus." And it was fantastic. It became a big deal in New York. Let's see, when was that? 82, yeah. 1982. And so then they said, well, we'll bring our best elephant up in front of the Whitney to maybe hit the newspapers, and then everyone will know and everyone will give money. So I called somebody that I knew was connected to a foundation and had the capacity to give us a lot of the money. And I came up to meet the Targa, which was the name of the elephant, in front of the Whitney. And Targa reached her beautiful trunk and picked me up and put me on top of her back. And it was so cool. I loved it. I just loved that elephant. And I saw that the guy I had called actually was there. His name was Seymour Klein, and he did actually come, and he waved, and he said, "Come see me, come see me." So Tom Armstrong and I went to see him, and he gave us half the money, just like that. So we saved the Calder Circus. Thank you.
So after hearing about the perils of social media earlier today, I thought that was a good story about how you can operate without social media. Just go out to the parks, call the circus.
That's true.
So I think we should open up the floor to questions, and I think we might have mic runners, or there's, okay. Questions? No?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was wondering, as someone interested in the arts and interested in the field of museums, what advice you would give to get into that field and start working in the city under the field of art museums?
I think you have a better answer. so long ago for me. I used to know the answer to that, but I don't think it's the same answer anymore.
Well, I would say it sort of depends what you want to do, but I would start by looking at a lot of art and talk to people in galleries. There are some galleries there's a wonderful gallery right here in Kent. I would talk to them, the James Barron Gallery. And there are internships at various museums. There's a wonderful teen program at the Whitney that is a fantastic way to get to know the ins and outs of the art world. There's all sorts of programs these days. I think the auction houses have programs, but get to know as many people as you can.
And internships, if you wanted to do that, I think.
Definitely. Yes.
Just wait for the microphone, please.
Microphone's coming.
Thank you. My name is Cynthia Hill. I take kids to the Whitney every year as a way of getting them to be interested in visualizing art. Do you have lots of schools that come to the Whitney, public schools, private schools that come, just to get the children to understand what it's like to be in a museum?
Thank you so much. I'm so impressed that you bring your students all the way from here. It's wonderful. Well,
That's great.
The education department at the Whitney has always been a hallmark, and school groups have come for years and years and years. And I'm also a teacher and have brought classes many, many times. And the docents, the educators at the Whitney are spectacular. So yes, it happens a lot, and in many different ways, appropriate to whatever group it is. It's very thoughtfully done. Yes, James.
Could you tell us a little bit about future expansion?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about things that are happening right now. And maybe Scott, would you like to answer that question? I'll answer it then. So one thing that's happening that's very exciting is that so in the meatpacking district where the Whitney is, there are a lot of artist studios there, which is sort of remarkable because we think of Manhattan as this place that is not affordable for artists, and yet it still is quite a community for artists. And the artist Roy Lichtenstein had a studio right near about 3 blocks from the Whitney for many, many years. And the Whitney is now going to work with the Lichtenstein Foundation to do programs out of Roy Lichtenstein's studio, which will be quite spectacular, both for artists and for the general public. So that's one thing that's happening that is so uniquely tied to the Whitney's mission that it's wonderful. And then we are also planning this, we're raising money for this big David Hammons piece called Day's End that you may have heard about, and you can see a video about it on the Whitney's website. It's spectacular. I encourage you to go have a look at that video. That too.
And then the Breuer building, nobody knows what will happen yet about that, but it still belongs to the Whitney. It's still the Whitney's building.
All right, we have a few more seconds. Ken, yes.
Would you please talk about the efforts that the Whitney makes to reach out and ensure that it represents all of the artists across America?
Good question. Would you like to answer that?
Scott.
No. Poor Scott.
Hello, I'm Scott, the chief curator at the Whitney. It's interesting you asked that question because I just yesterday had a meeting with the two co-curators of our upcoming Whitney biennial, and we reviewed their travel plans for the next few months and for the last 6 months. And they had been to not every state, but definitely in Texas, in the Midwest, in California, to Puerto Rico, to Florida, and their research is quite broad. So I don't think we can say that we reach every artist, but we're definitely looking well beyond New York. And we have an artist on view right now, Mary Corse, who's from the West Coast, so we do our best to look broadly.
And would you just mention the other shows that are at the Whitney? Because that in itself is a pretty broad.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We have a show there right now called Pacha Yakta Wasishai, which are 3 Taino words. It's the most widely spoken indigenous language in the Americas. And the 5 of the 7 artists in that exhibition were actually born in other countries than the US, Latin American countries, but we see them as US Americans because they all live here right now in 4 different states, I think, if I'm getting that correct, and Puerto Rico. And then there's a wonderful exhibition of the artist David Warnerovich, who died in 1993 of AIDS. And it's a very powerful show, very politically aware and engaged. And those 2 shows are both up until the 30th of September. So please come see them.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for coming.